The battered wooden box trembled in Annie McGraw's calloused hands as she knelt on the splintered floor of their one-room shack. The desert wind whistled through the gaps in their rotting walls, carrying with it the scent of desperation and dying dreams. Her tears fell onto the weathered wood, each drop a betrayal of the sacred promise she was about to break. "Please, Mr. Reddick," she whispered, her voice cracking like dried leather. "Just $1 silver. That's all I'm asking." The trader loomed in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the harsh afternoon sun. His beard was streaked with gray, his clothes dusty from weeks on the trail. But his pale blue eyes held something she couldn't quite identify, recognition perhaps, or the weight of old memories. Behind him, pressed against the door frame like a wounded animal, 9-year-old Eli McGraw watched with eyes that burned with fury and heartbreak. The box in his mother's hands was sacred. The only tangible connection he had to his father, who had died 2 years ago in the mine collapse that had stolen their comfortable life. Annie could still see Samuel's face that autumn evening when he'd given the box to Eli. Her husband had knelt on this very floor, his strong miner's hands gentle as he placed the wooden container in their son's small palms. The lamplight had flickered across his weathered features, and his voice had carried the weight of secrets when he spoke. "This here's for when you're older, son." Samuel had set his dark eyes serious. "Family things inside important things you ain't ready to understand yet. But promise me something, Eli. Promise me you won't try to open it until you're a man grown. And promise me you'll keep it safe no matter what comes." Eli had nodded solemnly, his 7-year-old mind grasping the gravity of the moment. "I promise, Papa. I'll keep it safe forever and ever." "That's my good boy," Samuel had murmured, ruffling Eli's hair. "This box, it's got our family's future in it. You remember that." Now, as Annie held that same box out to a stranger, she felt the weight of her son's betrayed trust crushing her chest. She was shattering the sacred bond between father and son, selling away the future Samuel had died trying to protect. "Mama, don't," Eli whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. Annie's hands shook as she lifted the box higher. "My husband said it held family secrets, nothing worth much. Just old letters, maybe, or some photographs. But we ain't eaten in 3 days, and Mr. Briggs is coming for the rent at sundown. If I don't pay him—" Her voice broke. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the terror that kept her awake at night. The image of her and Eli wandering the desert until the sun and thirst claimed them both. Reddick's weathered hand moved slowly toward the box, and Annie caught something in his expression, a flicker of pain, as if he recognized not just the container, but the desperation that drove her to sell it. "Your husband's name," he said quietly, his voice rough with desert dust. "What was it?" "Samuel." Annie replied, confusion flickering across her tear-streaked face. "Samuel McGraw. Why do you—" "Samuel McGraw," Reddick repeated, and there was something in the way he said it that made Annie's chest tighten. "Good man. Brave man." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a single silver dollar, holding it up to catch the dying light. The coin seemed to pulse with significance, as if it carried the weight of destiny itself. "I'll take it," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would shatter their world and remake it in ways none of them could imagine. Set-up Annie McGraw had been a different woman when Samuel was alive. 2 years ago, she'd been the confident wife of a skilled miner, a woman who hummed while she cooked and laughed at her husband's stories. They'd owned a proper house with real glass windows, 3 fat hens that laid eggs every morning, and a garden that produced enough vegetables to share with their neighbors. Samuel would return each evening with copper dust in his hair and tales of the underground world he worked in. He'd sweep Eli into his arms and spin him around the kitchen until the boy shrieked with delight, then settle into his chair by the fire to tell stories of hidden chambers and crystal formations that sparkled like captured starlight. "The earth's full of secrets, son. Samuel would say, his voice taking on that special cadence that meant a story was coming. But she don't give them up easy. You gotta earn them, got to prove you're worthy of the trust. Annie would listen from the kitchen, her hands busy with supper, her heart full of contentment. They weren't rich, but they had enough. They had love, hope, and the kind of security that came from Samuel's steady wages and skilled hands. The mine collapse changed everything in the span of a heartbeat. A support beam that had been weakening for months finally gave way during the night shift, bringing down an entire section of tunnel. Samuel and 6 other men were buried under tons of rock and earth. The rescue efforts continued for 4 days, but when they finally reached the trapped miners, there were no survivors. The Consolidated Mining Company paid each widow $20 and walked away from the devastation. The mine was declared unsafe and sealed forever, leaving dozens of families with no income and no hope. Annie had fought to keep their life together with the desperation of a drowning woman. She'd taken in washing until her hands cracked and bled from the harsh lye soap. She'd scrubbed floors for the few families wealthy enough to afford help working until her knees swelled and her back screamed in protest. She'd even swallowed her pride and asked the church for charity, only to be told that they helped those who helped themselves. The flash flood came 10 months after Samuel's death, a wall of water that swept through the valley like divine judgment. It killed their chickens, destroyed their garden, and damaged their house so badly that they couldn't afford the repairs. The bank foreclosed within 2 months, and Annie had been forced to move to the shack at the edge of town, a ramshackle structure that had once housed Mexican workers and now served as a monument to their fall from grace. Through it all, the wooden box had remained on their makeshift mantelpiece, unchanged and unchanging. Eli would sit before it for hours, talking to it, as if Samuel could hear him through the wood and brass fittings. He'd tell it about his day at school, about the boys who mocked his patched clothes and empty lunch pail, about how much he missed his father's stories and strong arms. "I'm keeping it safe, Papa," he would whisper during those long conversations. "Just like I promised. I ain't gonna let nothing happen to it." Annie had watched these one-sided dialogues with a mixture of love and heartbreak. Before Samuel's death, she'd barely noticed the box. It had been just another piece of furniture, part of the comfortable background of their daily life. But now, she understood what it meant to Eli, how it served as his last connection to the father he'd adored. Until this morning, when she'd counted their remaining coins and found 8 cents. 8 cents between them and starvation. 8 cents between them and the desert. The rent was due at sundown, and Mr. Briggs had already made it clear that his patience was exhausted. "I ain't running a charity, Mrs. McGraw," he'd said during his last visit. "You pay up or you get out. Simple as that." She'd looked at the box with new eyes, then seeing it not as a sacred memorial, but as their only remaining asset. Samuel had been a practical man, a man who'd valued his family's survival above all else. Surely he'd understand why she had to break her promise, why she had to sell the thing Eli treasured most. What Annie didn't know was that Thomas Reddick had been watching their shack for 3 days, waiting for the right moment to approach. What she didn't know was that he'd recognized her name when Mrs. Patterson had mentioned that poor McGraw widow in casual conversation at the general store. And what she especially didn't know was that Thomas Reddick had served alongside Samuel McGraw in the 2nd Arizona Volunteers during the war. That he'd been there when Samuel had made a decision that would echo through the years to reach this moment of desperate choice. "Tom," Samuel had said one night during their march through New Mexico, "if something happens to me, if I don't make it home, you promise me you'll look after Annie and the boy." "Nothing's gonna happen to you, Sam," Reddick had replied, but Samuel had grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Promise me," he'd insisted. I got things arranged for them. Insurance, you might say. But they're gonna need someone who knows the truth to help them when the time comes." Reddick had made that promise beside a dying campfire, surrounded by the sounds of sleeping soldiers and distant coyotes. Now, 20 years later, he was finally in a position to keep it. As he took the box from Annie's trembling hands, he felt the weight of more than just wood and metal. He felt the weight of friendship, of promises made and kept, of a secret that had traveled through time to reach this moment of reckoning. "Much obliged, ma'am," he said, his voice carefully neutral. But his eyes held depths that Annie couldn't fathom, and when he looked at Eli, there was something almost like recognition in his gaze. Inciting incident. The silver dollar landed in Annie's palm with a soft chime that seemed to echo through the shack like a funeral bell. She stared at the coin, her mind struggling to process what she'd just done. The metal felt cold against her skin, inadequate payment for the trust she'd just shattered. Behind her, Eli's breathing had become sharp and shallow, like a wounded animal fighting for air. She could feel his stare burning into her back, could sense the exact moment when disappointment transformed into something much worse. "Much obliged, ma'am," Reddick said. But there was something in his voice, a gentleness that hadn't been there before, as if he understood the magnitude of what had just transpired. Annie stood on unsteady legs, her whole body trembling from more than just hunger. She turned to face her son, the silver dollar clutched in her fist like a talisman she wasn't sure she wanted to possess. The look in Eli's eyes was worse than any physical blow she'd ever received. It was the look of a child who'd just watched his mother betray everything he held sacred, who'd learned that even the people you trusted most could break your heart when desperation demanded it. "Eli, honey," she began, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but we didn't have any choice. We needed the money or—" "No." The word exploded from the boy's lips with such force that both adults stepped back. His young face was flushed crimson with rage and anguish, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You promised Papa, you said we'd never sell his things. You said we'd keep them safe." "Son, you don't understand." "I understand plenty." Eli's voice rose to a shriek that made Annie's chest constrict with pain. "You sold Papa's box. You sold the only thing he left me. You're a liar. Mama, you're a liar, just like everyone else." The accusation hit Annie like a physical blow. "Eli, please. We need the money. If we don't pay Mr. Briggs, we'll be thrown out into the desert. We'll die out there." "I don't care." Eli screamed, tears streaming down his dirt-stained cheeks. "I don't care if we die. At least Papa would still be proud of us. At least we wouldn't be." "We wouldn't be." He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the betrayal that was tearing his young heart apart. Instead, he turned and ran his bare feet, pounding against the hard-packed earth as he fled the scene of his mother's treachery. Annie started after him, but her legs were weak from hunger and her vision blurred with tears. She made it 3 steps before stumbling, catching herself against the doorframe as the world spun around her. "Ma'am," Reddick said quietly, and when she looked up, she saw something unexpected in his weathered face. Not judgment, but understanding. "That boy's carrying a heavy burden." "I know," Annie whispered, her voice barely audible. "But what choice did I have? Let us starve, let him watch me waste away to nothing." Reddick was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Your husband," he said finally. "Samuel. He ever tell you about the war?" Annie frowned, wiping tears from her cheeks. "Some. He didn't like talking about it much. Said there were things better left buried." "He was a good man," Reddick said, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him more closely. "Brave. The kind of man who'd do anything to protect his family." "You knew him." It wasn't a question. "I knew him," Reddick confirmed. "And I think he'd understand what you did today. Sometimes love means making choices that break your heart." He mounted his horse, securing the box carefully in his saddlebags. "That boy of yours, he's got his father's fire. That's not a bad thing, but fire can burn if it ain't handled right. What do you mean? I mean he's hurting now, but he's also learning. Learning that the world ain't always fair, that good people sometimes have to make hard choices. That's a lesson every man needs to learn. Annie watched as Reddick touched his hat brim in farewell and urged his horse into motion. The animal's hooves raised small clouds of dust as they moved through the street past the general store and the saloon past the church, where prayers seemed to go unanswered, and out toward the open desert. As they disappeared into the shimmering heat, Annie felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The immediate crisis was solved. She had the money for rent, could buy food for another few days. But she'd paid a price that went far beyond. Silver dollars had damaged something precious that might never heal. The sound of sobbing drew her attention to the empty lot behind Morrison's store. Eli had taken refuge there, curled up behind a pile of discarded lumber, like a wounded animal seeking shelter. His father's old shirt hung loose on his small frame, making him look even younger and more vulnerable than his 9 years. Annie walked toward him slowly, her heart breaking with each step. She wanted to comfort him, to explain, to somehow make him understand. But how could she explain betrayal to a child? How could she make him see that sometimes love required sacrifice? "Eli," she said softly, settling down beside him in the dust. "I know you're angry. I know you feel like I broke my promise to Papa. But, go away." Eli mumbled, his face buried in his arms. "I don't want to talk to you." "I know you don't. But I need you to understand something. Papa loved us more than anything in this world. More than any old box, more than any promises. And if he were here right now, he'd tell you the same thing I'm telling you, that keeping us alive is more important than keeping old keepsakes." Eli lifted his head, and Annie saw that his eyes were red and swollen from crying. But it was his mama. It was the only thing we had left of him. "No, baby," Annie said, reaching out to touch his face. "We have more than that. We have his love, his stories, his memory. We have each other. That's what really matters." "But I promised him," Eli whispered. "I promised I'd keep it safe." "And you did," Annie said. "You kept it safe for 2 years. But now Papa would want us to use it to stay alive. He'd want us to be together, to survive, to build the life he always dreamed of for us." Eli was quiet for a long moment, his young mind struggling with concepts too large for his experience. Finally, he looked up at her with eyes that seemed older than they should be. "Do you really think he'd understand?" he asked. "I know he would," Annie said, and for the first time since making her desperate choice, she truly believed it. Papa was a practical man. He knew that sometimes you have to break small promises to keep big ones. "What big promise?" "To love each other, to take care of each other, to never give up, no matter how hard things get." Eli nodded slowly, and Annie saw some of the anger drain from his young face. It was replaced by something else, a sadness that seemed too heavy for a child to carry, but also a kind of understanding. "I still miss him," Eli said quietly. "I miss him too," Annie replied. "Every day. But we're going to be okay, Eli. We're going to survive this, and we're going to make Papa proud." As the sun began to set over the desert painting, the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Annie held her son close and tried to believe her own words. They'd survive tonight, maybe even tomorrow. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that selling the box had set something in motion that would change their lives forever. She had no way of knowing that 3 miles away in a hidden camp in the Badlands, 2 men were already planning to take everything Thomas Reddick owned, including the wooden box that held secrets worth killing for. First obstacle. The night crawled by like a wounded animal, slow and painful. Annie lay on their thin mattress, listening to Eli's restless breathing and the wind that never seemed to stop howling through the gaps in their walls. Every creak of the old shack made her heart race. Every distant sound made her wonder if someone was coming for them. She'd paid Mr. Briggs his money at sundown, watched his cruel smile as he counted the coins twice before pocketing them. "See how easy that was, Mrs. McGraw," he'd said. "Amazing what people can accomplish when they put their minds to it." The humiliation had burned almost as much as the guilt, but they had a roof over their heads for another month. That was something at least. When the pale light of dawn finally crept through their single window, Annie rose quietly and dressed. Eli was still sleeping, his young face peaceful in a way that made her chest ache with love and regret. She'd let him rest a while longer before waking him for the day ahead. The soft knock on their door made her freeze. It was barely past sunrise, too early for normal visitors, too late for anyone with good intentions. Annie grabbed Samuel's old revolver from the wooden crate where she kept it, hidden her hands trembling as she approached the door. "Who is it?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's Sarah Patterson, dear. Can we talk?" Annie relaxed slightly and opened the door. Mrs. Patterson stood on the porch, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, her weathered face creased with worry. She was 10 years older than Annie, a widow who'd survived her own share of hardship and loss. "Mrs. Patterson," Annie said, stepping outside and closing the door behind her. "You're up early?" "I couldn't sleep," the older woman said. "I've been thinking about what happened yesterday. About that traitor in the box." "What about it?" Mrs. Patterson glanced around nervously, as if she expected to be overheard. "Annie, I don't think you know what you've gotten yourself into. That man Reddick, he's not what he seems." Annie felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "I mean, he's got a reputation. A bad one." Mrs. Patterson's voice was low and urgent. "My nephew works the silver mines up in Tombstone, and he's seen Reddick there. The man deals with outlaws, Annie, murderers and thieves. He buys things cheap and sells them to criminals who don't ask questions about where they came from. But he seemed like a regular trader I know. That's what makes him dangerous. He's got a gift for reading people, for knowing when they're desperate enough to make bad choices." Annie's mind raced. "You think he knew the box was worth more than a silver dollar? I think he knew exactly what he was buying," Mrs. Patterson said grimly. "And I think he's already made arrangements to profit from it." The older woman reached into her apron and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I sent my nephew a telegram yesterday evening asking him to make some inquiries. This is what he wired back." Annie unfolded the paper with shaking hands. The message was short but chilling. "Reddick seen with known outlaws. Stop Price and Dolan. Very dangerous. Stop advise. Caution. Stop." "Price and Dolan," Annie whispered. "According to my nephew, they're wanted men. Robbers and killers who've been terrorizing the territory for months. If they're working with Reddick..." Mrs. Patterson didn't need to finish the sentence. Annie understood the implications perfectly. She'd sold the box to a man who might be in league with murderers, who might even now be planning to use whatever secrets it contained to bring violence down on her family. "What do I do?" Annie asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Mrs. Patterson admitted. "But I think you need to be very careful. If that box contains something valuable, something worth killing for, then you and Eli might be in real danger." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of their door opening. Both women turned to see Eli standing in the doorway, fully dressed and carrying a small bundle of belongings. "Eli," Annie said, alarm creeping into her voice. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to get it back," the boy said, his young face set with determination. "I'm going to find Mr. Reddick and get Papa's box back." "Absolutely not," Annie said, stepping toward him. "You're not going anywhere, young man. It's too dangerous." "I don't care about dangerous," Eli said, backing away from her. "I care about Papa's box. You sold it, so I'm going to get it back." Eli listened to me, but the boy was already running his small legs, carrying him toward the edge of town with surprising speed. Annie started after him, but her legs were weak from hunger, and her heart was pounding with panic. "Let me get Sheriff Morrison," Mrs. Patterson called after her. "He'll know what to do." "There's no time," Annie shouted back. "By the time we get the sheriff, Eli could be miles away. He doesn't know how dangerous the desert is." She ran into the house and grabbed her few possessions, the revolver, a canteen of water, and what little food they had left. Her father had taught her some basics of desert survival when she was young. Lessons she'd hoped never to need. How to read tracks in sand and stone, how to find water, how to avoid the worst dangers of the wilderness. Those lessons came flooding back now as she followed Eli's trail toward the Badlands. The boy's footprints were clear in the dust, small and determined, following the deeper hoofprints left by Reddick's horse. "God, help us," she whispered, checking to make sure the revolver was loaded. "God help us all." The desert stretched out before her like a sea of sand and stone, beautiful and terrible in its vastness. And somewhere in its depths, her son was walking toward a fate that might destroy them both. As she began to follow the tracks, Annie tried to remember everything her father had taught her about survival in the wilderness. The sun was climbing higher, and soon the heat would become unbearable. She had to find Eli before the desert claimed him, before his small body succumbed to thirst and exhaustion. Behind her, Mrs. Patterson was already running toward the sheriff's office, her own heart racing with fear for the family she'd tried to help. She'd send Morrison and his deputies after them, but she knew it might be too late. In the Badlands, death came quickly to those who weren't prepared for its harsh embrace. And somewhere out there, a 9-year-old boy was learning that lesson the hard way. Rising action. The sun climbed higher as Annie followed the tracks deeper into the Badlands, her father's half-remembered lessons guiding her through the harsh landscape. The trail was clear at first, Eli's small boot prints, following the deeper impressions left by Reddick's horse. But as the morning wore on, the wind began to scatter sand across the tracks. After 2 hours of walking, her water was already running low, and her legs were beginning to shake with exhaustion. The desert was unforgiving, and she was starting to understand why so many people who ventured into the Badlands never returned. That's when she found the first sign of trouble. It was just a scrap of cloth caught on a thorny ocotillo bush. But Annie recognized it immediately. A piece of Samuel's old shirt, the one Eli had been wearing when he left. The fabric was torn, as if it had been ripped away in a struggle. Her chest tightened as she examined the area more carefully. The tracks were confused here, overlapping and chaotic. Eli's small footprints were joined by larger ones' boot prints that spoke of men who spent their lives in the saddle. Men who knew how to move fast and strike hard. And there, in the soft sand beside a boulder, she found drops of blood. Not much blood, just a few spots dark red against the pale sand, but enough to tell her that violence had already occurred somewhere ahead. Annie's hands shook as she checked her revolver. 6 bullets against God knew how many men. She'd never killed anything larger than a rattlesnake, but if someone had hurt her son, she was prepared to learn. The blood trail led her up a rocky slope, where the stone was loose and treacherous. She had to use both hands to climb, scraping her palms on the sharp edges. Her father had taught her that injured animals often sought high ground, looking for defensible positions or escape routes. Maybe the same was true for people. At the top of the ridge, she could see for miles in every direction. The Badlands stretched out like a moonscape of red stone and twisted metal carved by centuries of wind and flash floods into fantastic shapes. In the distance, she could see dust devils dancing across the flats, and the shimmer of heat waves made the horizon waver like a mirage. She was about to continue down the other side when she heard voices carried on the wind. They were coming from somewhere below, echoing off the canyon walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint their exact location. Annie crept to the edge of the cliff and peered down into a natural amphitheater formed by the surrounding rocks. What she saw made her blood freeze. Hidden in the rocks below was a camp of fire pit supplies and 3 horses tied to a dead juniper. But it was the people that made her grip the revolver tighter. 2 men stood near the fire, their faces hard and weathered by years of violent living. The taller one was lean and scarred with a jagged line running from his left temple to his jaw. He wore his gun low on his hip, like a man who'd used it often and well. The shorter man was built like a bull, with massive shoulders and arms thick as tree trunks. His beard was streaked with gray and stained with tobacco juice. Both men had the predatory look of wolves, so the kind of men who killed for profit and slept soundly afterward. And there, bound to a dead tree with his face bloody and swollen, was Thomas Reddick. The traitor was conscious, but barely, his head lolling as the two men discussed something in voices too low for Annie to hear clearly. But she could see Samuel's box sitting open beside the fire, its contents scattered on a blanket. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized what had happened. These men, Price and Dolan, she remembered from Mrs. Patterson's telegram, had robbed Reddick and taken the box. They'd opened it, discovered whatever secrets it contained, and now they were planning their next move. But where was Eli? Annie strained her eyes, searching the camp for any sign of her son. Finally, she spotted movement in the shadows beyond the fire. A third man, younger than the other two, with the cruel face of someone who enjoyed causing pain, was dragging something toward the main camp. No, not something. Someone. Eli. She whispered, her voice barely audible, even to herself. Her son was alive, but clearly hurt. His face was streaked with tears and dirt, and there was blood on his lip where someone had struck him. The man Cortez, she heard one of the others call him, had bound the boy's hands and was now forcing him to sit beside the fire. Little bastard led us quite a chase. Cortez was saying, his voice carrying more clearly now. Found him about a mile back, following the tracks like some kind of Indian scout. Good, said the scarred man, Price. Now we got leverage. The boy's daddy left us a real interesting letter, and I got a feeling Junior here knows more than he's letting on. Annie watched in horror as Price pulled a yellowed piece of paper from his shirt pocket. Even from this distance, she could see that it was covered in Samuel's careful handwriting. Tell me, boy. Price said, his voice deceptively gentle. Your papa ever tell you stories about the war, about things he might have acquired during his service? I don't know what you're talking about. Eli said, his voice small and frightened, but still defiant. Papa never told me nothing about no war. And now that's a lie, Price said, backhanding the boy across the face. Eli cried out and fell to the side, and Annie had to bite her lip to keep from screaming. Don't lie to me, boy. Price continued. Your daddy's letter here tells a real interesting story. About Confederate gold, about hidden treasures, about things that could make a man rich beyond his wildest dreams. Annie's mind reeled. Confederate gold. What had Samuel been involved in during the war, and why had he hidden the truth from her all these years? I'm telling you the truth, Eli sobbed. Papa never told me about no gold. He just said the box had family secrets. Maybe he's telling the truth. Dolan said, his voice like gravel in a tin can. Maybe the boy really don't know nothing. Or maybe he needs some encouragement to remember, Price said, drawing a wicked-looking knife from his belt. Boys got good memories when they're properly motivated. Annie knew she had to act. She couldn't watch them torture her son for information he didn't possess. But she was one woman with a gun she barely knew how to use, facing 3 armed men in their own territory. She studied the camp layout, looking for any advantage she might have. The men seemed confident, relaxed in their isolation. They probably thought they were safe from pursuit out here in the Badlands. That was their mistake. Annie began to work her way down the cliff face using handholds and ledges that her father had taught her to recognize. The stone was loose and treacherous, and she had to move slowly to avoid starting a slide that would announce her presence. As she descended, she could hear more of the conversation below. Price was reading from Samuel's letter, and every word was like a knife in her heart. My dear boy. Price read in a mocking voice. If you're reading this, then I'm gone. and you're old enough to know the truth. The gold in this box is just a small part of what I took from a Confederate supply train during the war. I know it was wrong, but I was thinking of you and your mother." Annie's legs almost gave out. Samuel had been a thief. Her gentle, honest husband had stolen gold during the war. "The rest is hidden in the old mine shaft where I used to work before the war," Price continued. "Follow Willow Creek north from the abandoned Turner claim count, 50 paces past the lightning-struck boulder. Then look for the mark I carved in the rock face. The cave is behind the false wall I built to hide it." Annie closed her eyes, trying to process this revelation. All these years of poverty and struggle, and there had been a fortune waiting for them in the desert. Samuel had died before he could tell her, before he could reveal the secret that might have saved them all. "So what do you think, boy?" Price asked, his voice dripping with false kindness. "Any of this sound familiar? Your papa ever take you on walks to old mines, ever show you special rocks or carvings?" "No," Eli whispered. "He never took me nowhere like that." "That's too bad," Price said. "Because if you can't help us find that gold, then you ain't much use to us, are you?" Annie was close enough now to see the cruel satisfaction in Price's eyes, the way he was enjoying Eli's terror. She had to do something, had to create a distraction that would give her a chance to reach her son. But as she prepared to make her move, she heard something that made her blood run cold, the sound of approaching hoofbeats. More men were coming. And from the sound of it, they were in a hurry. Midpoint twist. Annie pressed herself against the rock face as the hoofbeats grew closer, her heart hammering so hard she was sure the men below would hear it. 3 riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon, their horses lathered with sweat and foam. "Price," the lead rider called out. "We got company coming." Price looked up from where he'd been menacing Eli with his knife. "What kind of company?" "Sheriff's posse. Maybe 6-7 men. They're following the tracks from town." Annie's chest tightened with hope and terror. Sheriff Morrison had come after them, but his arrival might trigger a bloodbath that would get Eli killed. "How far back?" Price demanded. "Hour, maybe 2, but they're moving fast." Price cursed and began barking orders to his men. "Dolan, get the horses ready. Cortez, pack up the gold. We're moving to the cave." "What about the boy?" Cortez asked. "He comes with us. If there's really a treasure hidden in that mine, we're going to need him to find it." Annie watched in growing desperation as the outlaws broke camp with practiced efficiency. They bound Eli's hands more securely and threw him onto one of their horses, ignoring his cries of pain and fear. "What about the traitor?" Dolan asked, nodding toward Reddick. "Leave him," Price said. "He's served his purpose." But as they prepared to ride out, Reddick spoke for the first time since Annie had been watching. "Price," he said, his voice hoarse but determined. "You're making a mistake. How's that? That boy really don't know nothing about the gold. His daddy died before he could tell him. But I know where it is." Price turned back to the traitor, his scarred face twisted with suspicion. "You're lying." "Am I? Who do you think helped Samuel hide it in the first place? Who do you think knew about the letter, about the box, about all of it?" Annie felt her world tilt. Reddick had been involved in Samuel's wartime activities. He'd known about the gold all along. "You're saying you were partners?" Price asked. "I'm saying I was there when he buried it. I'm saying I know exactly where to find it, and I know tricks that ain't in no letter. Hidden passages, false walls, booby traps Samuel set up to protect his treasure." Price studied Reddick for a long moment, then nodded to Dolan. "Cut him loose. But if you're lying to me, traitor, you'll die slower than you can imagine." As Dolan cut Reddick's bonds, Annie saw something that made her chest flutter with hope. The traitor's eyes swept the canyon walls, and for just a moment, they met hers. He'd seen her. He knew she was there, and in that brief glance, she saw something that looked like a plan. "All right," Price said, mounting his horse. "We're all going to take a little ride to this mine. And if the gold ain't there, if this is some kind of trick, I'm gonna start cutting pieces off the boy until somebody tells me the truth. The outlaws rode out of the canyon in single file, with Eli bound on Cortez's horse and Reddick on foot, his hands tied behind his back. Annie waited until they were out of sight, then began to climb down the rest of the cliff face. She had to follow them, had to find some way to save her son. But she was one woman against 4 armed men, and she had no idea where they were going or what they planned to do when they got there. As she reached the bottom of the canyon, she found something that made her pause. Reddick had left a message for her scratched into the dirt, where only she would see it. "Follow, stay back, trust me." Annie stared at the words, her mind racing. Could she trust the man who'd bought her son's inheritance for a silver dollar? The man who'd apparently been involved in Samuel's wartime crimes? She thought about Eli bound and helpless on an outlaw's horse. She thought about the gold Samuel had hid in the treasure that might be her son's only chance of survival. And she thought about the look in Reddick's eyes when he'd seen her, not the look of a man planning betrayal, but the look of a man preparing for war. Annie checked her revolver one more time, then began to follow the tracks deeper into the Badlands. The sun was climbing toward its zenith, and the heat was becoming unbearable. But somewhere ahead, her son was riding toward a confrontation that would determine all their fates. She had to reach him in time. She had to trust that Reddick knew what he was doing, and she had to be prepared to kill to protect the only thing in the world that mattered to her. The desert stretched out before her, vast and unforgiving. But Annie McGraw was no longer the desperate widow who'd knelt on her shack floor begging for a silver dollar. She was a mother whose child was in danger, and that made her the most dangerous creature in the wilderness. As she walked, she began to understand what Samuel had felt during the war, what had driven him to steal Confederate gold and hide it in the desert. Sometimes love demanded actions that went against everything you believed about right and wrong. Sometimes protecting your family required you to become someone you never thought you could be. Second obstacle. The trail led Annie through increasingly treacherous terrain, winding between towering rock formations and across dry creek beds filled with loose stone. Her father's lessons came back to her as she followed the tracks: how to read the age of hoofprints, how to tell direction from the way sand was scattered, how to move quietly across different types of ground. But those lessons had been taught to a young girl playing at being a scout, not to a desperate mother pursuing armed killers. The reality was far more difficult and dangerous than she'd imagined. After 3 hours of walking, she was exhausted and dehydrated. Her water was nearly gone and the sun was merciless. Every step sent jolts of pain through her legs, and her vision was beginning to blur from the heat. That's when she heard the gunshot. It came from somewhere ahead, a sharp crack that echoed off the canyon walls. Then another and another. Someone was shooting, and Annie's blood turned to ice as she thought about what that might mean. She pushed herself harder, ignoring the pain in her legs and the burning in her lungs. The tracks led her up a narrow canyon that twisted between sheer walls of red sandstone. The passage was so narrow that her shoulders brushed against both sides, and she had to fight down a wave of claustrophobia. At the end of the canyon, she found herself looking down into a bowl-shaped valley where the tracks converged on what looked like an abandoned mining operation. There were old wooden structures, rusted equipment, and a creek that sparkled in the afternoon sun. And there, near the center of the valley, she could see the outlaws. Price and his men had dismounted and were gathered around what looked like a cave entrance in the side of a cliff. Reddick was there too, no longer bound, but clearly under guard. And beside him, sitting on a boulder with his hands still tied, was Eli. Annie's heart leapt with relief. Her son was alive and appeared unharmed, though she could see the fear in his posture, even from this distance. She began to work her way down into the valley, using rocks and scrub brush for cover. The descent was treacherous, and twice she nearly lost her footing on loose stone. But she was driven by a desperation that made her ignore the danger. As she got closer, she could hear voices carried on the desert wind. "Now I'm telling you it's here," Reddick was saying. Samuel described this place to me 100 times. The cave's behind that rock fall about 30 feet back. Then why ain't we found it yet? Price demanded. Because Samuel was smart. He didn't just hide the gold, he hid the entrance. We need to move some of these rocks to get to it. Annie watched as the outlaws began to clear away loose stone from the base of the cliff. They worked quickly, but carefully, and after about 20 minutes, they'd exposed what looked like a narrow opening in the rock face. There, Reddick said, pointing to the opening. That's it. Price studied the hole suspiciously. Looks mighty small. How do we know this ain't a trap? Because I'm gonna go in first, Reddick said. If there's any traps, I'll spring them. But I'm telling you, Price, this is it. This is where Samuel hid the gold. All right, Price said. But if you're lying, if this is some kind of trick, the boy pays the price. To emphasize his point, Cortez drew his knife and held it to Eli's throat. The boy whimpered, but tried to be brave, and Annie had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. I understand, Reddick said. Just don't hurt the boy. He's innocent in all this. That depends on what we find in there, Price said. Annie watched in growing tension as Reddick began to work his way into the narrow opening. The hole was barely wide enough for a man to fit through, and he had to crawl on his hands and knees to make any progress. For several minutes, there was nothing but silence. Then Reddick's voice came echoing out of the cave, muffled but excited. Jesus Christ, he said. It's here. It's all here. What Price called back. What do you see? Gold, Reddick replied. More gold than I've ever seen in my life. Bars, coins, jewelry. Samuel wasn't lying, he really did it. The outlaws looked at each other with a mixture of greed and disbelief. They'd found it. After all the violence and threats, they'd actually found the treasure. But Annie could see something in Reddick's voice, that the others missed a note of deception, as if he wasn't telling the whole truth. Start bringing it out, Price ordered. All of it. It's going to take a while. Reddick called back. There's a lot here and the passage is narrow. But I'm coming out with the first load now. Annie held her breath as Reddick began to emerge from the cave. He was carrying what looked like a leather pouch, and even from her hiding place, she could see that it was heavy. That's just the beginning, he said, handing the pouch to Price. There's 10 times as much still in there. Price opened the pouch and poured out a handful of gold coins. They caught the sunlight and glittered like captured fire, and Annie could see the greed burning in the outlaw's eyes. How much more? Dolan asked. Enough to make us all rich, Reddick said. But we're going to need rope and saddlebags to get it all out. And we're going to need time. Time's something we don't have much of, Price said. That sheriff's posse is still out there. Then we better work fast, Reddick said. But I'm telling you, this is worth the risk. As the outlaws began to organize themselves for the work ahead, Annie realized that this might be her only chance. They were distracted by the gold, focused on the treasure rather than their prisoners. If she could create a diversion, maybe she could get Eli away from them. But as she prepared to move, she heard something that made her blood freeze, the sound of approaching hoofbeats. More riders were coming, and from the sound of it, they were moving fast. Shit, Price said, looking up from the gold. Company's coming. Sheriff, Cortez asked. Don't know, but we ain't taking any chances. Everybody in the cave, now. Annie watched in growing horror as the outlaws began to drive their prisoners toward the narrow opening. If they went into that cave, she'd never be able to reach Eli. She'd lose him forever in the darkness under the earth. She had to act now while they were still in the open. Annie stood up from her hiding place and raised her revolver, her hands shaking with fear and determination. She'd never shot at a human being before, but she was prepared to learn if it meant saving her son. Let him go, she shouted, her voice echoing across the valley. The outlaws spun around, their weapons already in their hands. For a moment, everyone was frozen in a deadly tableau. mother and son separated by 30 yards of open ground, and the men who would kill them both without hesitation. Then Price smiled, and Annie knew that her desperate gamble had just made everything worse. "Well, well," he said. "Look what we got here. The boy's mama come to join the party." Climax. "Drop the gun, lady." Price said, his voice calm and deadly. "Drop it now, or I'll cut your boy's throat." Annie's hands shook as she kept the revolver trained on the outlaw leader. 30 yards separated her from Eli, 30 yards of open ground that might as well have been 30 miles. She was one woman with a gun she barely knew how to use, facing 4 armed men who killed for a living. "I said drop it," Price repeated, and Cortez pressed his knife closer to Eli's neck. A thin line of blood appeared on the boy's skin, and he whimpered in terror. "Mama," Eli whispered, his voice barely audible across the distance. "I'm scared." Annie's heart broke at the sound of her son's voice. She could see the fear in his eyes, the way his small body trembled with shock and exhaustion. He was just a child caught up in something he didn't understand because of choices she'd made. "It's gonna be okay, baby," she called out, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "Everything's gonna be okay." "No, it ain't," Price said with a cruel smile. "See, your boy here's got information we need, and you just made yourself part of the bargain." "He doesn't know anything," Annie shouted. "He's just a child." "Maybe so. But you lived with Samuel McGraw for years. You must have noticed things, heard things. Where did he go on those long walks? What did he talk about when he thought you weren't listening?" Annie's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out of this nightmare. She could try to shoot Price, but the distance was too great and her aim was too poor. She'd probably miss, and then Cortez would kill Eli before she could reload. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, desperation making her voice crack. "Wrong answer," Price said and nodded to Cortez. The knife moved, and suddenly there was more blood on Eli's neck. The boy cried out in pain and terror, and Annie felt something break inside her chest. "Stop!" she screamed. "Please, I'll tell you anything I know." "Now you're being smart," Price said. "But first drop that gun and come down here nice and slow. Any sudden moves and Junior loses an ear." Annie looked at her son, saw the blood on his neck and the tears streaming down his face. She thought about Samuel, about the promises she'd made to protect their child. She thought about the gold hidden in the cave, about the secrets that had died with her husband. And she thought about the approaching hoofbeats that were getting closer by the minute. "All right," she said, lowering the revolver. "All right, I'm coming down." She began to pick her way carefully down the slope, her eyes never leaving Eli's face. With each step, she felt her chances of saving him slipping away. But she had to try. She had to do something. When she was halfway down, she heard a sound that made her heart leap. Sheriff Morrison's voice calling out from the mouth of the canyon. "This is the law, come out with your hands up." The outlaws looked at each other with expressions of panic and rage. They were trapped, caught between the sheriff's posse and the narrow confines of the valley. "How many men you got with you?" Sheriff Price called back. "Enough to end this peacefully if you surrender now." "I got a different idea," Price said. "I got hostages here, a woman and a boy. You try to take us and they die." Annie used the distraction to move closer to Eli. She was only 20 yards away now, close enough to see the terror in his eyes and the determination in his young face. He was trying to be brave, trying to be the man his father had wanted him to become. "Mama," he whispered when she was close enough to hear. "I'm sorry I ran away. I'm sorry I got us in trouble." "It's not your fault, baby," Annie said, tears streaming down her face. "None of this is your fault." "Enough talking," Price said, grabbing Annie's arm roughly. "You're gonna help us get out of here or your boy dies. Simple as that." That's when Reddick made his move. The traitor had been standing quietly near the cave entrance, seemingly forgotten in the chaos, but Annie had seen him slowly working his way closer to the outlaws, using their distraction to position himself for action. Now he lunged forward, tackling Cortez around the waist. The two men went down in a tangle of arms and legs, and the knife went flying through the air to land harmlessly in the dirt. "Run!" Reddick shouted to Eli. "Get to your mama." Eli didn't hesitate. Despite his bound hands, he rolled away from the struggling men and began running toward Annie. She met him halfway, pulling him against her chest and shielding him with her body. But the fight was far from over. Price had drawn his gun and was taking aim at Reddick, who was still wrestling with Cortez. Dolan was moving to flank them, his own weapon ready. "Should have minded your own business, traitor." Price set his finger, tightening on the trigger. That's when Annie did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She picked up her fallen revolver and fired. The shot went wide, as she'd known it would. But it was enough to make Price dive for cover, spoiling his aim and giving Reddick time to break free from Cortez. "The cave," Reddick shouted. "Get in the cave!" Annie grabbed Eli and began pulling him toward the narrow opening in the cliff face. Behind them, she could hear gunfire as the outlaws engaged in a running battle with Sheriff Morrison's posse. "I can't fit through there," Eli protested, looking at the narrow hole. "You have to," Annie said. "It's the only way to stay safe." She pushed Eli through the opening first, then began to squeeze through herself. The passage was even narrower than it had looked from outside, and she had to crawl on her hands and knees to make any progress. Behind her, she could hear the battle raging in the valley. Gunshots echoed off the canyon walls, and men were shouting orders and curses. But gradually the sounds were becoming muffled as she worked her way deeper into the cave. "Mama," Eli whispered from somewhere ahead of her. "I can't see anything." "Just keep going," Annie said, though she couldn't see anything either. "Stay close to me." The passage seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning through the rock. Annie's hands were scraped and bleeding from the rough stone, and her knees were raw from crawling. But she kept going, driven by the need to protect her son. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the passage opened up into a larger space. Annie could feel the air changing, becoming cooler and less confined. "Where are we?" Eli asked. "I don't know," Annie admitted. "But we're safe for now." She fumbled in her pockets and found the small box of matches she always carried. Striking one, she held it up to illuminate their surroundings. They were in a natural cave, much larger than the passage they'd come through. The walls were covered with strange formations that sparkled in the matchlight, and she could hear the sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness. And there, against the far wall, she could see wooden crates and leather bags. Samuel's treasure, the gold he'd hidden to secure their future. "Is that Papa's gold?" Eli asked, his voice filled with wonder. "I think so," Annie said, lighting another match. "But we need to get out of here first. We need to find another way out." As if summoned by her words, a voice called out from the passage behind them. "Mrs. McGraw, are you in there?" It was Reddick, and he sounded hurt but alive. "We're here," Annie called back. "Are you all right?" "I'll live," Reddick replied. "But we need to get out of here. The sheriff's got Price and his men pinned down, but they're not giving up easy." "How do we get out?" Annie asked. "There's another passage." Reddick said, his voice getting closer. "Samuel showed it to me years ago. It comes out about half a mile north of here." A few minutes later, Reddick appeared in the cave, his clothes torn and his face bloodied, but his eyes bright with determination. "You did good back there," he said to Annie. "That shot of yours probably saved my life." "I was aiming for Price," Annie admitted. "I know. But you gave me the chance I needed." Reddick looked around the cave, taking in the treasure that Samuel had hidden. "He really did it, didn't he, your husband? He actually pulled it off." "Tom," Annie said, using his first name for the first time. "What really happened during the war? What did Samuel do?" Reddick was quiet for a long moment. "He did what he had to do," he said finally. We all did. But that's a story for another time. Right now, we need to get you and the boy to safety. He led them to a crack in the back wall of the cave, another narrow passage that led deeper into the earth. It's tight, he warned, but it opens up after about 50 feet. As they began to make their way through the passage, Annie could hear the gunfire in the valley beginning to fade. Either the battle was over, or they were getting far enough away that the sound couldn't reach them. Tom, she said as they crawled through the darkness, why did you really come to Millbrook? Why were you looking for us? Because I made a promise to your husband, Reddick said simply. A promise I should have kept a long time ago. What kind of promise? To look after you and the boy if anything happened to him. To make sure you got what was rightfully yours. Annie felt tears streaming down her face. All these years she'd thought Samuel had left them with nothing. But he'd arranged for them to be cared for, had made sure they'd have a future, even if he wasn't there to provide it. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry I sold the box. I'm sorry I didn't trust you. You did what you had to do, Reddick said. Just like Samuel did during the war, just like I did when I came looking for you. Sometimes survival means making hard choices. The passage finally opened up into daylight, and Annie found herself blinking in the late afternoon sun. They were in a different canyon, well away from the battle in the valley. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from the direction they'd come from. Is it over? Eli asked, his voice small and tired. I think so, Reddick said. But we need to get you both to safety before we know for sure. As they began to walk toward the mouth of the canyon, Annie heard the sound of approaching horses. For a moment she tensed, afraid that Price and his men had somehow escaped. But then she recognized Sheriff Morrison's voice. Mrs. McGraw, are you all right? We're here, Annie called back. We're safe. A few minutes later, Morrison and 2 of his deputies appeared around a bend in the canyon. The sheriff's face was grim, but relieved. Thank God, he said, dismounting from his horse. We've been looking for you for hours. What happened to the outlaws? Annie asked. Price and Cortez are dead, Morrison said. Dolan's wounded but alive. He'll stand trial for his crimes. And the gold, still in the cave as far as I know. But that's something we'll need to sort out later. Right now, I just want to get you and the boy back to town. As they prepared to leave the canyon, Annie took one last look back at the hidden valley where so much had happened. Samuel's treasure was still there, waiting to be claimed. But more importantly, she and Eli were alive. They'd survived the nightmare that had begun when she'd sold a wooden box for a silver dollar. Mama, Eli said, taking her hand. Are we going to be okay now? Yes, baby, Annie said, and for the first time in years, she truly believed it. We're going to be just fine. Falling action. The ride back to Millbrook took place in the gathering dusk, with Sheriff Morrison's posse surrounding Annie and Eli like a protective shield. The wounded outlaw Dolan was tied to his horse and guarded by 2 deputies, his face pale with blood loss and the knowledge that he was likely riding toward a hangman's noose. Reddick rode beside Annie, his own wounds tended to with strips of cloth torn from his shirt. The trader was quiet, lost in thoughts that seemed to weigh heavily on his weathered features. Tom, Annie said as they paused to rest the horses near a small spring. I need to understand what happened back there. What Samuel did during the war. Reddick looked at her for a long moment, then at Eli, who was sitting nearby with his hands finally free, and his wounds cleaned. You sure you want to know some truths are harder to live with than ignorance? I need to know, Annie said firmly. We both do. Reddick nodded slowly. All right. But you need to understand something first. Your husband was a good man. Everything he did for you and the boy. He was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. It was during the spring of '63. Our unit was part of a larger force pushing through New Mexico, trying to secure the territory for the Union. We'd been fighting for months and morale was low. Men were deserting, supplies were running short, and it seemed like the war would never end. What happened? Annie asked. We intercepted a Confederate supply train, Reddick said. 3 wagons full of gold and silver meant to pay Confederate troops and buy supplies. It was a legitimate military action. We had orders to capture or destroy any enemy resources we encountered. But after the battle, when we were securing the wagons, Samuel made a decision. He saw how much gold was there, saw what it could mean for his future. For your future. Annie felt her chest tighten. He stole it. He took his share, Reddick corrected. Then he asked me to help him hide it. Said he'd seen too many good men die for nothing, too many families left with nothing when their breadwinners didn't come home. He wanted to make sure that wouldn't happen to you and Eli. How much did he take? Enough to last several lifetimes if it was managed properly. But he never touched it, never spent a single coin. He hid it in that cave and left it there, planning to tell you about it when the time was right. Sheriff Morrison had been listening to this conversation with growing interest. Now he spoke up. You're talking about stolen Confederate gold. Technically, that makes it government property. The Confederate government doesn't exist anymore, Reddick pointed out. And the Union Army wrote off those wagons as lost in action. As far as the military's concerned, that gold disappeared 20 years ago. But legally, it's complicated, Reddick said. But morally, it belongs to Samuel's family. He earned it with his blood and his service. The fact that he never used it for personal gain shows what kind of man he was. Annie absorbed this information slowly. Her husband had been a thief, yes, but he'd been a thief who'd stolen from the enemy to provide for his family. In the context of war, of survival, of the desperate choices men made in desperate times, it almost made sense. There's something else, Reddick said. Something I haven't told you yet. What? Samuel didn't just hide the gold. He wrote letters, lots of them, to you, to Eli, to explain what he'd done and why. I have them in my saddlebags. Annie's eyes widened. Letters from Samuel, 23 of them. He wrote them over the years, updating them as his thoughts changed as Eli grew older. He wanted to make sure you'd understand when the time came. Reddick reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a leather portfolio. These are for you, both of you. They explain everything, where the gold came from, how it's hidden, what he wanted you to do with it. Annie took the portfolio with trembling hands. The leather was worn smooth from years of handling, and she could see Samuel's careful handwriting through the thin paper. He never stopped thinking about you. Reddick said quietly. Even when he was dying, his last words were about making sure you and the boy would be taken care of. You were there, Annie asked. When he died, I was there. Mine collapse got us both, but I was luckier. Samuel made me promise to find you, to make sure you got what was rightfully yours. It just took me longer than I'd hoped. Tears were streaming down Annie's face now, and she felt Eli's small hand slip into hers. All these years, she whispered. All these years I thought he'd left us with nothing. He left you with everything, Reddick said. Not just the gold, but the knowledge that he loved you enough to risk everything for your future. Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat. We need to decide what to do about the treasure. I can't just ignore the fact that it exists. What do you recommend? Annie asked. Well, given the circumstances, given the fact that it's been hidden for 20 years, and the original owners are long dead, I'd say it's salvage. Finders keepers, in other words. No, but there will be legal challenges, Reddick warned. When word gets out about the gold, there'll be people claiming it belongs to them. The federal government, the state, maybe even some Confederate sympathizers. Then we'll deal with those challenges when they come, Morrison said. For now, Mrs. McGraw, I'd recommend you take possession of your husband's legacy and use it wisely." As they prepared to resume their journey, Annie opened one of Samuel's letters. The handwriting was familiar, the voice unmistakably his. "My dearest Annie." It began, "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and our son is old enough to understand what I've done. I pray you'll forgive me for the choices I made during the war, for the secrets I kept, for the burden I'm placing on you both." Annie closed the letter, unable to read more through her tears. There would be time for all of Samuel's words later. For now it was enough to know that he'd thought of them, that he'd planned for their future, even in the face of his own mortality. "Mama," Eli said quietly, "are we rich now?" "Yes, baby," Annie said, pulling him close. "We're rich now, but more importantly, we're safe. And we're together." As they rode toward Millbrook under the star-filled desert sky, Annie felt a sense of completion she hadn't experienced in years. The nightmare was over. The secrets were revealed, and the future stretched out before them like a promise finally kept. Samuel McGraw had kept his word. Even in death, he'd found a way to provide for the family he'd loved more than life itself. Resolution and final surprise, 6 months later. Annie McGraw stood in the parlor of her new house, watching through the lace curtains, as Eli played in the garden with their dog, a golden retriever they'd named Scout. The house was modest but comfortable, 6 rooms, a proper kitchen, and windows that let in the morning light without letting in the desert wind. The transformation had been remarkable. Sheriff Morrison had helped her convert Samuel's gold into legitimate currency through a series of discreet transactions in Tucson and Phoenix. The process had taken months, but it had been worth it to avoid the kind of attention that might have brought more treasure hunters to their door. Annie had been careful with the money, investing most of it in land and cattle, rather than spending it on luxuries. She'd bought a small ranch outside Millbrook, complete with a house barn and enough acreage to provide a good living for generations to come. But the real treasure had been Samuel's letters. 23 of them written over the years between his return from the war and his death in the mine. Annie had read them all some multiple times, and through them she'd come to understand the man she'd married in ways she never had when he was alive. The letters told the story of a soldier who'd seen too much death, who'd made a desperate choice in desperate times, and who'd spent the rest of his life trying to justify that choice to himself and to God. They revealed a man who'd been tormented by guilt over his wartime actions, but who'd been driven by love for his family to ensure their future security. "I know what I did was wrong," he'd written in one letter. "But I also know that right and wrong ain't always clear when you're watching good men die for causes they don't understand. I took that gold not for myself, but for you and our boy. I pray that someday you'll understand, and that you'll forgive me." Annie had forgiven him, of course. How could she not? The man who'd stolen Confederate gold had been the same man who'd read bedtime stories to their son, who'd held her when she was sick, who'd worked himself to death in the mines to provide for his family. Now, as she watched Eli laugh and play in the sunshine, she felt nothing but gratitude for the choices Samuel had made. The gold had given them security, but it had also given them something more precious, and the knowledge that they were loved, that they were worth fighting for, that their future had been precious enough to risk everything for. "Mrs. McGraw." The voice came from behind her, and Annie turned to see Maria Santos, the young woman she'd hired to help with the household. "There's a gentleman here to see you. Says he's from back east." Annie frowned. She wasn't expecting any visitors, especially not from back east. "What's his name?" "Mr. Harrison, James Harrison. He says it's about family business." Annie felt a chill run down her spine. Family business could mean any number of things, and not all of them were good. She'd been dreading this moment at the arrival of someone who might challenge their claim to Samuel's treasure. "Show him in," she said, smoothing her skirts and preparing for whatever confrontation might come. The man who entered her parlor was tall and thin, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He was well-dressed in the Eastern fashion, with a fine suit and polished shoes that spoke of prosperity and education. "Mrs. McGraw," he said, removing his hat. "Thank you for seeing me. I'm James Harrison, attorney at law from Boston, Massachusetts." "Mr. Harrison," Annie said, gesturing for him to sit. "What can I do for you?" Harrison opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I represent the estate of one Jonathan McGraw, recently deceased. Are you by any chance related to a Samuel McGraw who served in the Union Army during the late war?" Annie's heart skipped a beat. "Samuel was my husband. He died 2 years ago." "I see. And do you have children?" "A son, Eli. He's 9 years old." Harrison nodded, making notes on a legal pad. "Mrs. McGraw, I'm here because Jonathan McGraw left very specific instructions in his will regarding any surviving relatives. It seems he was Samuel's brother, though they lost touch during the war." Annie stared at him in shock. Samuel had a brother. Indeed. Jonathan never married, never had children. He spent his life building a successful import business in Boston. When he died last month, he left instructions that his estate should be divided among any surviving relatives of his brother Samuel. Harrison pulled out another document. "This is a copy of Jonathan's will. He left detailed instructions for locating Samuel's family, including hiring private investigators to search the territories. It took us months to find you." "I don't understand," Annie said. "What does this mean?" "It means, Mrs. McGraw, that you and your son are the sole heirs to Jonathan McGraw's estate. The total value is approximately $200,000. Annie felt the room spin around her. $200,000. On top of the gold they'd already found. It was an impossible amount of money, more than most people saw in 10 lifetimes. "There's more," Harrison continued. "Jonathan's will includes a letter addressed to his brother's family. Would you like me to read it?" Annie nodded, unable to speak. Harrison unfolded a piece of paper and began to read. "To the family of my beloved brother Samuel, whom I have not seen since the war separated us. I pray that this letter finds you in good health and that Samuel lived to see his children grow. I know that we parted in anger, that the war came between us as it came between so many families. But I never stopped loving my brother, never stopped hoping that we might be reconciled." Harrison paused, looking up at Annie. "Should I continue?" "Please," Annie whispered. "I have spent my life building a business, accumulating wealth, but I have no family to share it with. If Samuel is gone, if his widow and children are in need, then I pray this inheritance will provide them with the security and comfort that my brother deserved in life. I know that Samuel was a good man, a man who would have done anything for his family. I hope that this final gift will honor his memory and ensure that his sacrifice was not in vain." Annie was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she thought about the brothers Samuel had never mentioned, the family connection that had been lost to war and pride and the passage of time. "There's one more thing," Harrison said gently. "Jonathan left instructions that if Samuel's family was found to be in distress, if they were living in poverty or hardship, then his personal attorney should provide additional assistance. I've been authorized to offer you whatever help you might need, legal, financial, or otherwise." "Mr. Harrison," Annie said, wiping her eyes. "I appreciate your kindness, but we're not in distress. We're doing quite well, actually." Harrison looked around the comfortable parlor, noting the quality furnishings and the obvious signs of prosperity. "I'm glad to hear that. But the inheritance is yours regardless. Jonathan wanted to make sure that Samuel's family would never want for anything." As Harrison prepared to leave, Annie walked him to the door. "Mr. Harrison," she said, "why did the brothers part in anger? What happened between them?" Harrison was quiet for a moment. "According to Jonathan's private papers, They disagreed about the war. Samuel wanted to enlist to fight for the Union. Jonathan thought it was foolish that the war would accomplish nothing but death and destruction. They quarreled, said things they probably didn't mean. Then Samuel left for the territories. They never spoke again, and Jonathan regretted it. Every day of his life, according to his housekeeper. He used to say that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford, that family was more important than politics or principles. After Harrison left, Annie sat in her parlor for a long time, thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought them to this point. The box she'd sold for $1 had led to the discovery of Samuel's treasure, which had led to this second inheritance from a brother she'd never known existed. When Eli came in from the garden, his face flushed with sunshine and exercise, she called him over to sit beside her. Like she said, "I have something to tell you, something wonderful." "What is it, Mama?" "Your papa had a brother who loved him very much and who left us a great deal of money when he died." Eli's eyes widened. "Really? How much money?" "Enough to last us for the rest of our lives. Enough to send you to college, to travel the world, to do whatever you want to do." "Is that good?" Eli asked. Annie smiled and pulled him close. "It's very good, baby. But you know what's even better." "What?" "The fact that we're here together, that we're safe, that we have each other. That's the real treasure." Eli nodded solemnly. "I know, Mama. Papa would be proud of us, wouldn't he?" "Yeah, very proud," Annie said. "He wanted us to be happy, to be secure, to have the kind of life he always dreamed of. And now we do." That evening, after Eli had gone to bed, Annie sat on her porch and looked out over the desert. The stars were brilliant in the clear air, and she could hear the distant call of a coyote singing to its pack. She thought about Samuel, about the choices he'd made during the war and the legacy he'd left behind. She thought about the box that had started it all, the wooden container that had held not just gold and secrets, but love and hope, and the promise of a better future. The box itself was gone, destroyed in the cave-in that had followed the gunfight. But its contents, Samuel's letters, his love, his sacrifice, those were things that could never be lost or destroyed. Annie McGraw had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite that fear. She'd learned that love sometimes demanded impossible choices, that family was worth any sacrifice, and that the past could indeed save the future, if you were willing to face its truths. Most importantly, she'd learned that even in the darkest moments, even when all seemed lost, there was always hope. Sometimes that hope came in the form of a wooden box, sometimes in the form of letters from a long-dead husband, sometimes in the form of an unexpected inheritance from a stranger. But it was always there, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to look for it. As the desert wind whispered through the sage and the stars wheeled overhead, Annie McGraw closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude to the brother-in-law she'd never met, to the husband she'd loved and lost, and to the God who'd seen fit to bless them with more than they'd ever dared to dream. The box that had broken everything had also been the key to rebuilding it stronger and better than before. And in the end, that was the greatest treasure of all.